Now, as the name of the video implies, this is the third part of a story, so if you haven't seen the first two parts yet, I'd highly recommend checking them out first, or this likely won't make any sense to you. Links to them will be found in the description below. Also in the description will be very brief recaps of the first two parts, just in case you need a refresher. And now then, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start by getting a shot of a small shuttle flying through hyperspace, the one we saw in the last part that had brought Luke to Coruscant for his meeting with Han and Leia, before we're taken on board that shuttle into a small commons area where we see Luke sitting cross-legged, eyes closed, and in deep meditation. Just then, coming from the attached cockpit, enters a tall, almost sickly thin figure wearing Jedi robes with the hood up. He regards Luke quietly for a long moment before then saying, "I sense how difficult that was for you, how troubled you are that you couldn't stay and help your friends." Luke opens one eye, looks up at the tall figure and says, "You have no idea how hard that was for me, how hard it was to lie to them, and to just leave when every part of me wanted to stay." Luke shuts both eyes again, sighs and finishes, "But they cannot see what is happening to me. They wouldn't understand." The tall figure then replies, "I'm not sure I understand exactly what's happening to you either." Luke remains silent for a very long moment before then saying, "As Vader's power grows, as he becomes one with the dark side itself, so too does my power grow with the light, to the point where I must now almost constantly remain focused in order to control it." The tall figure then asks, "And you're sure it's him? You're sure it's Vader?" Luke gives a single nod of the head and simply says, "I'm sure." The tall, thin figure then pushes back his hood, and we see a handsome, almost human face with bright blue eyes and golden blonde hair. He takes a seat on the floor of the ship across from Luke, assuming a cross-legged position as well, and says as he shuts his eyes, "How is it we cannot feel his presence through the Force? Why do we only see the shadow that he casts?" Luke replies, "The nature of the dark side is shadow and deception, my apprentice. Sidious hid himself for years under the very noses of 10,000 Jedi, while only casting the faintest of shadows, just enough of one to cause the Jedi of the time to chase their own tails and fight a meaningless war that unbalanced the Force and galaxy, enough so for Sidious to come to power." Luke pauses then, lets out a tired sigh and continues, "For years after Endor, I tried to reach out through the Force to find Vader, to see if he had survived, only to see nothing more than an ever-expanding shadow, a darkness that threatened to one day engulf the Force itself. Unlike Sidious, Vader could not mask the shadow of his power, the strength with the dark side he was amassing, but also unlike Sidious, he was becoming so much more. So Vader instead hid himself within the growing darkness to keep me and any other who would oppose him off balance." The tall, thin figure nods in understanding and says, "And now that growing darkness makes you more powerful, my master, powerful enough to challenge and defeat Vader." To that, Luke frowns before saying, "It's not that simple. The Force seeks balance, and so my strength with it grows. But that strength within me is raw, unshaped. It threatens to either consume me or seduce me to the dark side if I unleash it and experience power like perhaps no other Jedi ever has." Luke then opens his eyes and gives a faint smile to the tall, thin figure. "Thus I decided to rebuild the Jedi Order, not only because the galaxy needs them, but I need them. I need others strong with the light to take on this burden." The tall figure thinks on all that for a moment, then asks with a hesitant expression on his face, "Speaking of rebuilding the Jedi Order, Master, I have to ask, where exactly did you find me? I remember so very little about my life before you started to train me, but when I try to focus and look back, I see pain, suffering. I see nothing but darkness and a twisted and wretched reflection of myself." Luke then quickly replies, "It matters not where you came from, Varad. All that matters is who you are now, the path that you walk now." Varad nods, but then says, "And this path you have decided to walk, where we're going now, are you sure this is the right course of action? You say you fear this power you possess, leading you down the dark path. And yet, are we not walking right into its very clutches now? Will you not be at the mercy of the dark side if you go through with this?" Luke once more shuts his eyes and says, "One can never be sure of what they will find when dealing with the dark side. But another once walked this path before me, and she will be my guide now." We then switch scenes and get a shot of the surface of the planet Malachor, before we then see a small Mandalorian ship skimming across that surface and heading for a giant crack in it and slowing down as it draws ever closer. We then watch as the ship slowly lowers itself through the crack in the surface and descends towards the destroyed ruins of an ancient temple, and eventually lands not far from a dark doorway that seems to lead down into the depths of that ruined temple. A few moments later, the ship's ramp lowers and two individuals walk down it. One is dressed in colorful Mandalorian armor, while the other seems to be an elderly Togruta female dressed in brilliant white robes and wielding a staff of some sort. The Mandalorian then takes her helmet off and tucks it under her arm, and we see the face of a nearly 60-year-old Sabine Wren turn towards the Togruta and say, "Are you sure about this, Ahsoka? You and I have gone to some pretty crazy places in the past, but the stories you told me about what happened to you in there." Sabine says no more, and instead finishes by just shaking her head and lowering her gaze away from the door, a door that Ahsoka's eyes have been locked upon the whole time. That's when Ahsoka says, "Trust me, my old friend, it's the last place I ever thought I'd set foot in again, but she may have answers that Luke needs." Sabine frowns, but seems to give a reluctant nod of the head. We then watch as Ahsoka takes a couple steps towards the door before she stops and shuts her eyes tight, which is when there is a flash. And when we see Ahsoka open her eyes again, we find ourselves in a memory of hers, and see that she is now much younger, the age she was the first time she came to this world and faced her old master who had become Darth Vader. And she stands in the exact same spot the older Ahsoka had just been standing moments ago, and also looking upon the same doorway that descends into darkness. We then watch as the younger Ahsoka, with a grim yet determined look on her face, walks towards the doorway and through it and into the ruins of the temple. After only a few steps, she takes hold of one of her lightsabers and ignites it and allows the pure white light to help her negotiate the darkness. And after we watch her walk the ruined halls for some time, she comes to what remains of the cavernous chamber where she had, not long ago from her perspective, just fought Darth Vader. That's when she hears a female voice echo all around her that says, "Why have you come here, child?" Ahsoka then glances over her shoulder, and behind her we can see the vague shadowy form of a female figure wearing dark robes. To her, Ahsoka says, "I came here to learn from you." The shadowy figure gives a cackling laugh and says, "There is no darkness in your heart, child, no desire to defy the will of the Force and bend the powers of this galaxy to your desire." Ahsoka nods her head to that and says, "You're right. I'm not here to learn how to use the dark side to dominate and destroy others. I'm here to learn how to stop it, forever. And I realize now the only way to ever truly do that is to fully understand it." Once more, the vague, shadowy figure gives a cackling laugh before saying, "Fool, why would I teach you how to stop the darkness, assuming such a thing was even possible?" Ahsoka now slowly turns around and faces the figure. She shakes her head and says, "I know you won't teach me how to stop it, but you will teach me how to wield it. You won't be able to resist yourself but to, because of your overconfidence, your faith and your belief that the dark side will be stronger than me, that it will corrupt me, and I will finally be your ticket out of this place, out of this prison of yours." We then focus in on the shadowy figure, and in the darkness we can see a smile form on a very ancient face. She then says, "A challenge then." Ahsoka gives one nod of the head and replies, "A challenge then." There is then another flash, and we find ourselves back in the present and watch as the older Ahsoka now opens her eyes and looks upon the doorway into the temple. We hear Sabine calling her name, and apparently has been for a little bit now, by the urgency in her voice. Ahsoka then says to her, not taking her eyes off the door, I'm sorry, Sabine, I got lost in the past there for a moment." Sabine gives a bit of a chuckle and says, "Not the first time that's happened. What with all we went through to find Ezra, only to have him leave us again." But Ahsoka shakes her head and says to that, "He didn't leave us. He too is doing what he must to end the darkness, and finally bring a lasting balance to the Force." And with those words, the scene ends, and we find ourselves now in space, looking at the planet Jakku, when suddenly, not far from it, we see an old Imperial Super Star Destroyer emerge from hyperspace, followed by roughly a dozen more regular-sized old Imperial Star Destroyers. That's when we're taken on board the Super Star Destroyer and into the dark chambers of Darth Vader, where we can just make out the old and deteriorating face of Vader being illuminated once more by the gold glow given off by the small stone that hovers before him. And just like the last time Vader used it, it seems to be projecting an image, and this time we see the Jedi Council Chamber at sunset, high atop the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and sitting alone in it is Anakin Skywalker, and the look upon his face is one of a man being torn apart, and we quickly realize what we're seeing. It's the past, where Anakin is contemplating whether or not he should do as Mace Windu has instructed, and let him and the other Jedi handle the arrest of Palpatine, or if he should go and make sure nothing happens to Palpatine, so that he'll survive and can eventually learn from him how to save Padme's life. After looking upon the conflicted Anakin for some time, the image slowly fades away, and a moment later the doors to his chamber slide open, and in walks his apprentice, wearing the dark, glossy metallic mask with red accents that almost looks like the face of a demon. She quickly falls to a knee, lowers her head, and as soon as the doors slide shut behind her, Vader says, "I have a new task for you, Darth Ison." "A new task for me, my master," she says back, her head lifting slightly. "What could be more important than finding the holocron of Plagueis, learning his secrets so that perhaps your body can be healed before it's too late?" Vader doesn't answer that question, but instead commands, "You will go to Coruscant and abduct Senator Solo of Corellia and bring him to me." There is a moment of confused silence before Darth Ison replies, "Senator Solo? Why? What's so special about him? He's nothing more than a junior senator who only has any real power at all because of his mother." Vader then simply replies, "The Force is with him." Again, there's a long moment of confused silence before she says, "But what does it matter if the Force is with them? The galaxy is full of Force-sensitive beings, none of which you've ever had any interest in until now." Vader says nothing to that. Instead, the doors behind Darth Ison simply slide open, and after a moment of reluctance, she gets to her feet and says angrily, "It shall be done, my lord," and then storms out of the chambers. We then switch scenes, and now find ourselves back on Malachor and just outside the temple again, where Sabine and Ahsoka are looking up at a small shuttle that is coming in for a landing next to their ship. Soon enough, the ramp of the shuttle lowers, and walking down it, we see both Luke Skywalker and his tall apprentice Varad. And as soon as Ahsoka sees them, she begins to walk towards them, a beaming smile upon her face to match the smile that is now on Luke's face. The two then embrace like longtime friends, and Ahsoka says, "It is so good to see you again, Master Skywalker." Luke pulls away from her, gives her a feigned look of anger, and says, "How many times do I have to tell you to just call me Luke?" Ahsoka shakes her head in an apologetic way and says, "Sorry, the words Master Skywalker just come so easy to me, that's all." Luke nods his head in understanding to that, but there is a hint of sadness in his eyes as he does. That's when all the smiles completely fade, and Ahsoka says, "Are you sure about this?" "No," Luke quickly replies, his gaze turning towards the dark doorway. "But I don't see any other way. If what you've told me about her is true, there is much I could learn from her, and maybe I can even learn a way to stop Vader." Ahsoka gives a reluctant nod of the head and says, "She knows and has been master of both light and dark, though the goodness that may have once been in her is completely gone now. She will gladly give you the answers you seek, but, like with all that are consumed by the darkness, her truths will be twisted by her dark point of view." Ahsoka lays a hand on Luke's arm and says, "She will show you the dark path, Luke, and if you're not careful, you will find yourself walking down it with no way to get back." Luke then sighs, nods his head, and seems about ready to head for the doorway, but stops himself and instead turns around and walks up to Varad and says, "If I don't make it out of there, or if what comes out isn't me anymore, you know who to find." Luke then reaches into a pocket of his robe and pulls from it a small stone, not unlike the one Vader now possesses. He places the stone in Varad's hand and says, "He'll be the only hope any of us have if I fail." To that, Varad seems like he wants to argue about the possibility of Luke failing, but instead simply shuts his eyes and nods before placing the stone in his own pocket. Luke then turns around and sees that Ahsoka is saying her goodbyes to Sabine, and after Luke also says goodbye to Sabine and apologizes to her about this being an adventure she won't be able to join them on, both Luke and Ahsoka look at each other and simply give a nod before walking side by side towards the dark doorway and then threw it. We then switch scenes and get a shot of the Senate building on Coruscant at night before we're taken inside it and into a dimly lit office where we see a tired-looking Ben Solo sitting at a desk and looking over several different datapads and seeming completely disinterested in what he's doing. After watching him for a moment, we see him set the datapads aside and open what appears to be a secret compartment in his desk, and from it, he pulls a lightsaber. Then, with an almost childlike grin of excitement on his face, he gets to his feet, moves to a clearing in his otherwise rather small office, and ignites the blue-bladed saber and begins to swing it about rather awkwardly. We even watch as he pretends to block the attacks of some invisible foe and pushes his hand out as if using force powers. And that's when a woman's voice says, "You're going to hurt yourself with that thing." Instantly, Ben deactivates the saber and hides it behind his back as if, somehow, the woman now standing in the shadowy doorway to his office hadn't seen it despite referencing it. Ben then says, "Who are you? How'd you get in here?" The woman, who has long red hair and is young, maybe not even quite 20 years old yet, grins at him and says, "I used the Force." Ben frowns, tosses the lightsaber onto the desk and says, "Yeah, very funny. Now tell me who you are and what you're doing here, or I'll call security." The smile on her face grows and she says, "Go ahead and call them. Something tells me they won't answer." At this point, Ben smiles nervously and now simply says, "What is it you want?" The young woman seems to walk right up to Ben, which only makes him even more nervous, before then walking right past him and picking up the saber Ben tossed onto the desk. She then says as she's examining it, "Where'd you come by this?" To that, Ben shrugs and says, "Bought it from a dealer in the Undercity. Don't ask how much I had to pay for it." The young woman chuckles and then ignites the saber, which causes a startled Ben to jump and take a few cautious steps back. "Careful with that," he warns. "It's not a toy and..." But Ben instantly falls silent when he watches as the young woman performs a series of beautifully executed flourishes with the saber, before simply deactivating it and tossing it back onto the desk, and giving a shrug as if that was no big deal. Ben then asks, Who are you?" The young woman smiles at him, points over her shoulder with her thumb and says, "Someone who can teach you how to use that thing for real." And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story and what you think might happen next. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.